This conference will now be recorded.
Welcome to this demo on OCI identity domains. In this demo, we are going to take a quick look at what identity domains look like. So the first thing I do here is I log into my account, and this is the name of my account. I click next here, and it will bring me to the login screen. And the first thing you notice here is it telling me that I have a default domain. As you recall from the theory lesson, when you provision your OCI account, you are given a default identity domain which is called default, and it's available for free. And if you hover over this information box here, you can see the description for identity domain. It's a container for managing users and groups and SSO and federation and advanced capabilities. So I would provide my credentials here and then hit on sign in. And you would see that as I sign into my account, you can see identity domain in action. So first thing I'm going to do is click on the burger menu here and click on identity and security and click on domains here. So first thing you notice here within you have different columns with different features and sub features, and within identity you see things like overview, domains, network sources, policies, compartments, etc. Right? You no longer see things like users, groups, etc. Available as part of the menu here. So if you click on domains, as we discussed, it's a container, and the container has all these capabilities where you manage your users, your groups, etc. So you can see here that by default I have an identity domain which is called default, and you can see here in parentheses it says this is my current domain. And if I click on this, I can see it's active. You can see various features. So I can manage my users here, I can manage my groups here, dynamic groups can be managed here, and there are more advanced capabilities like applications, reports, security, etc. If I click on security, it brings up lots of advanced capabilities like MFA. How do I set my change my MFA settings, OAuth, federation, how do I set up identity providers and adaptive security, and so on and so forth, right? In this particular course, we are not going to deal or touch many of these features. In more other advanced courses, we will look into these. So if I go back to my domain type, I can see here that there are a lot more capabilities. I can run some reports, I can configure MFA, I can configure SSO, etc. I can also change my domain type. So if I click here, it gives me an option to change from the default free domain type to premium, Oracle Apps Premium, or external user. I believe external user is not allowed, so if you click on it, not let me proceed, but others you could change. Let me go back and try to create another domain and show you how easy it is to create a domain. So why would I do that? Well, let's say I have a use case where I have a sandbox which I want to manage for development purposes, and I want to give users access to that sandbox. Once the work is done, I could delete the whole sandbox and all the associated identities. So I click on create domain here, and I can give it a name. Let's say call it sandbox, call it sandbox domain. It's a free domain, so I'll use that. And then I need to create a domain administrator. Now I could choose not to do that, but let's do that. Provide my name here, and I need to provide my email ID, and then I click create domain here. And you would see that within a few minutes my domain would be created here, and this is my secondary domain. So I could create domains like these, and you should always read up on the limits, etc. And once the domain is created, I could add users. Like you see here, the various users which are available. I have various groups which are available, so I could create my users groups, my dynamic groups, etc. Now one thing quickly I'll note here is policies sit outside domain. So the idea is you can write policies independent of the domains, and domain is a resource. So when you create multiple domains, you would write your policies accordingly where you reference the domain name. And in another lesson, we will look into how you would do that. And you would see here within less than a minute, my sandbox identity domain is created. So that's how simple it is to use these domains. A couple of quick things I just want to point out is on the documentation page, you can see the difference between all the SKUs. As we mentioned, there is free, there is Oracle Apps Premium, there is Premium, and there is external user. There's also something called Oracle Apps, but this is internal to kind of Oracle SaaS applications which we are running, so you don't see that in the console. And as you scroll down, you can see all the different kind of features, capabilities, and the premium SKU is the highest SKU, so you will see most of the features are available in the premium SKU, but you should definitely take a look here and see what different features are available. And you scroll down, you can see limits, etc., how many domains you can create, your API rate limits, etc. Another resource to use are the FAQs. So if you scroll here on this particular URL, you can see FAQs for identity domains and other IAM features. A couple of things I just want to call out is things like, can I mix employee non-employees in a single identity domain? No, idea is to keep them separate, right? And you can read more about them. Who has access to an identity domain? Anyone who is part of the administrators group uh, has access to identity domain. Right here, there's an important point I want to point out is you identity domains are resources. So they are created inside of a compartment, and access to manage these domains is tied to the compartment permissions. So not necessarily everybody, you have to give access to the identity domains. You can restrict access by putting them within separate compartments. In our case, when we created identity domain, we put them in the root compartment, but I could have decided to scope it in another compartment. So that was a quick demo on identity domains, how to create one, what different kind of features are available, and some quick FAQs on it. I hope you found this demo useful. Thanks for your time. We Welcome to this demo on OCI Identity and Access Management Authentication. In this particular demo, we are going to look at how you can create users, groups, and in a subsequent demo, we are going to look at how you can authorize these users to perform certain actions. So let's get started. In a previous demo, we created a domain called Sandbox. As you recall, when you create an OCI account, you get a default identity domain which is a free domain, but you can create secondary identity domains. So in this case, we have gone ahead and created an identity domain which is called Sandbox. So we're going to use that particular domain. Now, as you scroll here, you can see users, groups, etc. listed on the left hand side. If I click on users, you can see today I'm logged in as an admin. So this is the only user which is available. And for the groups, you can see that there is all domain users and there is also a domain administrator. So any user you create could either go as a domain user or could go as a domain administrator. So let me go ahead and create a user here. It's pretty straightforward to create. Let's say first name is John Doe, and for my email, I already have an email ID which I use for another course. So I will use that email ID as the username, or you could decide to use username as something else. So that seems a little bit more convenient. So let me do that. And my username I would refer to as john.doe. And then right here, I could put this particular user as a domain user, or I could put the user as a domain administrator. So let me skip this for now and let me just click create here. And what will happen now is this particular user is created and I can assign this user to a group. We'll create a group in a second. But right now, the email ID I provided, this particular user would get a notification saying that an account, I have been provisioned as a user in this particular account and I need to activate my account. So before we do that, let's go ahead and create a group here. So click on create. The two groups exist here. Let me go ahead and create a network admin group. So this group is called network admin, and this is the group for network admins for the sandbox domain, and I'll create this particular group here. And then what I'll do is I'll assign users to this particular group. I'll assign John Doe to this particular group here. And it's pretty straightforward here until this point, right? So now what I need to do is I need to log in as this particular user and see what kind of what the experience looks like. So in my email ID, I get this email saying that my account is ready and I can activate my account. So let me just log out from my other email ID here, and actually I can sign out now, close this tab, and I click on activate your account here. And this is now John Doe who is trying to sign in. So first thing you see here is identity domain now is sandbox. It's no more default because this particular user belongs to a sandbox domain, not the default domain. And the username is John.Doe, and it's asking me to pick a new password. And I can set, as you can see here, it gives me some restrictions on the password policy. It must have 12 characters, lowercase, uppercase, you can read here. And I can customize this experience. Now in this particular course, we are not going to touch on some of these capabilities, but you can customize your password policies, etc. using the identity domains. So I don't want to save this, and I click on continue to sign in. And now this is my tenancy. I'm signing in as, and now you can see here it's asking me to sign in to a domain, and I click sandbox here, click next, and then it's going to ask me for my username and password again. Click sign in, and now I would be able to sign into my account. Don't want to save this password, and you can see here that if I click on identity and security and I click on domains, I'm not able to see. If I click on sandbox, I can see the users here and groups, and you can see that these permissions are not allowed for me, right? And you might wonder and say why this is happening. The reason this is happening is, remember, this particular user is part of network admin group. He's not part of a domain administrators group. So this particular user doesn't have the authorization to look at users, groups, or perform any of these activities. In the next lesson, we are going to write some policies for this particular user and give him some access so he can perform some actions. Couple of things I just quickly want to show on here is, if I click on this on the right hand side menu, I can see click on my profile, and it brings up various other capabilities which we talked about earlier. So there are things like API signing keys, there are auth tokens, etc. So I can generate an auth token here. There's, I can add an API signing key here, and there are lots of other capabilities like my request, etc., which come over from Oracle Identity Cloud Services. Now in this particular course, but in a subsequent more advanced course, we are going to look into a bunch of these details. So I hope this was a quick demo on how to create a user, how to get started. In the next one of the subsequent demos, we are going to look at how you can provide access to this particular user to perform certain actions. I hope you found this demo useful. Thanks for your time. Welcome back. As we saw in the theory lesson, authentication has to deal with identity or who someone is, while authorization, also referred to as AuthZ, has to do with permissions or what someone is allowed to do. In this particular demo, let's quickly look at how authorization is done in OCI. As we saw earlier, we have the default identity domain which gets created automatically when you create an account with OCI, and we created another identity domain called sandbox. If we click on it, we see that we also created an user referred to as John Doe. Now let's quickly go ahead and give some permissions to John Doe, because today the user exists but he has no permissions, so he's not allowed to do anything in OCI. So let me just quickly go ahead and create a group here and name this group OS admin, and this is a group for object storage administrators, and I will add John Doe to this particular group. Until now, we just added John to a group, but we haven't written a policy against that group. And remember, policy is what is the mechanism through which we do authorization in OCI. So if I quickly log in as John Doe here, I want to quickly show you this in action. So if I log in as John Doe, you would see that John is not allowed to do anything in this particular account. So that's the tenancy name. We'll choose the sandbox identity domain because that's where the user exists. And sign in. And now you will see that signed in as John Doe in the identity domain called sandbox. And if I come here and I click on storage, for example, and I want to create a bucket, I will not be allowed to do that. So if I click here, I can see the root compartment, but it gives me an error saying I'm not authorized to perform this request. And the same is true for any other service. If I click on virtual cloud network, you can see the same error message or a similar error message saying authorization failed. And you can go ahead against any other service and you would get the same error. So what it means is I don't have any permission to do any activity in this account right now. So if I quickly switch back to the administrator for this domain, we just created a group called OS Object Storage Admin Group, but we haven't written a policy against it. And if you remember, policies are written outside the identity domain. So if I click on policies here, we can quickly go ahead and create a policy. So let's go ahead and do that. We will say that this is an object storage policy, and there is a nice policy builder using which I could create a policy. So if I click on account management here, it gives me option to pick an identity domain. I can pick a particular group or a dynamic group, and I can also pick a location to scope policy out, whether the policy is applicable to the root tenancy or it is applicable to a particular compartment. So I could use this policy builder. It's a nice way. If I'm not too familiar with the syntax, it makes it much easier. But let's manually create this. Let's remove these policy statements right now and just quickly write this policy. And this policy here says that allow group sandbox, this is my identity domain, OS admin, so this is the group we just created, to manage object family, meaning users can create objects, can create buckets, upload objects in this particular compartment, sandbox dash compartment. So my scope is only limited to this particular compartment. And I click create here, and now this policy is created. And what this policy is let me do will allow this particular group, OS admin group, and all its members to work with object storage family, object storage resources. So if I switch back to John Doe's screen here, just quickly refresh the screen. Now, first thing you notice here is I see this compartment which was not visible here. So if I just stay on the root level, you can see that I still cannot do anything. It says authorization failed. But if I click on sandbox compartment, that error message will go away. So if I just refresh the screen. Alright, I'm in a virtual cloud network, so I'm in the wrong place. So let me just click on buckets here. And since we wrote the policy against the sandbox compartment just for object storage, in the previous screen, you saw we were in virtual cloud network. There's no policy against that. So of course I couldn't do anything. So if I go back to root here, you would see the same error. I cannot create a bucket in the root compartment at the tenancy level because I don't have authorization for that. But I can do that on the scope of the sandbox compartment. So if I click on create bucket here, just give a random name, click create, I should be able to create a bucket here. And the default behavior is it's a private bucket. So I can see that visibility is private, but I'm able to create the bucket here because now I have the permissions to operate on object storage and its resources in this particular compartment. So hopefully this was a quick demo where we took a user, we added the user to a group, and then we wrote a policy against that particular group. And in the policy, the resource and the verb we said could manage all the resources for object storage, and we scoped it to this particular compartment. So you could work on object storage for this particular compartment. You could, in a similar way, you could write more advanced policies against every service, and you can go very granular. So hopefully this was a quick demo on how authorization is done in OCI. Thanks for your time. Welcome to this demo on OCI compartments. As you recall from the theory lesson, compartments are the primary building blocks for you to organize your cloud resources. You use compartments to organize and isolate your resources. When your tenancy is provisioned, there is something called a root compartment, which is automatically provisioned for you. So if you can see the view here, if I click on this compartment called OCI Arc Associate, it says this is the root compartment of the tenancy. So you don't have to create it. It automatically gets created when your tenancy is provisioned. Now this particular root compartment can hold all your cloud resources, but it's not a good best practice to do that. We saw that in the theory lesson. You should create separate compartments, because the whole idea of compartments are to logically isolate your resources so you can better manage them and you can secure them, etc. Now, a couple of things to keep in mind. Compartments obviously are logical resources, they're not physical. They can span multiple regions, and the relationship between resource and compartment is one-to-one, meaning a single resource can go in a single compartment, but one compartment can hold multiple resources. So one-to-many relation between compartment and resources. When you write policies, you always specify the compartment name, because that's kind of the logical resource where placeholder where the resource lives, and that's true when you call the OCI CLI. You always have to specify the compartment, otherwise we don't know where the resource exists. And compartments can act as a filter, where you can filter out resources depending on the compartment OCID or the name. And there is something called a tenancy explorer, where you can see a list of all the resources which exist within a compartment. So we'll look into all of these, but let's quickly go through some of these here in a little bit more detail. So you can see this is the root compartment, and within the root compartment, I can see the child compartments as three compartments here. Remember, all the compartments you create subsequently once your tenancy is provisioned are called the child compartment. So you can see there are three here. I could create more, and I can actually create a hierarchy here. And the hierarchy means I can create a child compartment within, let's say, the networking compartment or the sandbox dash compartment. I could create another child compartment, and so on and so forth. I could create hierarchy which can be up to 6 levels deep. Why would you do that? Well, let's say you have an organization, you want to mimic your organizational hierarchy. So you can have like a North America region, you can have a Europe region, Asia region, and within that you can have different business units. So you could create your compartments like that, and quite flexible design, so you could decide whichever way you want to do that. Now let's go ahead quickly and create a compartment here. So first thing I need to do is give it a name. Let's say I'm creating a compartment for compute resources. So I'll specify the name here. I can decide where to create this compartment. So for now, like I said, I could create it as a child compartment within, let's say, networking, or I could create it under the root compartment, which is what I'm going to do here. And I could put some tags here. There's also something called a security zone, and security zone, as you can see here, is a logical group of compartments. When you create and update resources in a security zone, all operations are validated against the policies you define in the security zone. So think about this as a more secure compartment, and you can specify that as you know, when you're creating a compartment, you can specify that it's a security zone, and you write policies accordingly there. So we are not going to touch on that for now. So just let's go ahead and create a compartment here. And you would see within a few seconds that my compute compartment gets created. And if I click here, I can see it has no child compartment. There is nothing, I can add tags here, etc. Now let me quickly go to, so I can see a list of compartments here. Let me quickly show you how I can see within these compartments to see what kind of resources exist. So if I click on governance and administration here, you would see that under governance, I have a link for Tenancy Explorer. And what this does, it, as the name specifies, it lets me explore my tenancy and all the compartments I have here. So remember we talked about compartments can act as filters. I can see the list of compartments on the left hand side. And if I click on sandbox dash compartment, or if I click on compute compartment, which we just created, you can see that there are no resources which are found in this compartment. But if I click on some other compartment, I can see a bunch of resources, buckets, route tables, VCN, etc. If I click on the root compartment, I can see a whole set of resources. And if we scroll here, there are many more resources which exist in this particular compartment here. So if I scroll here, you can see that there are more resources which exist here. So if you again recall, we could put everything in the root compartment. It's not the best practice to do that. It should create separate compartments to logically isolate your resources. So hopefully this was a quick demo on how you can create a compartment and you can view all the resources which exist within a compartment. In the next demo, we are going to look at some of the quota policies, how you can set quotas on compartment, because one of the most important things you need to do as an administrator is to make sure that allocate quotas on your compartment so your users can create resources, but you don't exceed whatever the quotas you set for those compartments. So we'll look into that in the next demo. I hope you found this demo useful. Thanks for your time. Welcome to this demo on compartment quotas and budget. Compartment quotas is a mechanism for you to control resource consumption within your individual compartment. So let's get started. Let me just pull up the documentation page because I want to clarify a couple of things here. So one thing which you might have a question on is how are compartment quotas related to service limits? The biggest difference here is that the service limits are set by Oracle and compartment quotas are set by administrators using policies that allow them to allocate resources with a high level of flexibility. So think about this as another mechanism which is given by Oracle for you to control resource consumption. So you can do that on a more granular level. Now, how do we set these compartment quotas? Well, we write a policy, but these policies are a little bit different than the policies you have been using for writing the generic IAM policies you have been using. Now, there are three types of quota policies which are statements which are available. One is the set. It sets the maximum number of cloud resources that can be used. The next one is unset. It resets the quota back to the default service limits. And there is something called zero, which removes access to a cloud resource for a compartment. It's very handy because let's say you have a bare metal machine, service limits enabled for you, but you don't want your users to create these bare metal machines because these have 52 cores and they're quite expensive. So if you want to prevent that scenario, you could zero out any kind of bare metal provisioning. So your users cannot create any machines which are bare metal. So let me quickly go ahead and create a quota and show this functionality in action. Now, before I do that, let me just bring up limits, quotas, and usage. And if I click on this, and for example, it showing me compute here, you can see that I have various quotas which I can see here. So if I click on my sandbox compartment, you can see that most of these service limits are zero for me. Let me just pull up and see the service limit which is available. So if I scroll further down, I can see here that the cores for standard A1 based virtual machine instances, I have 4 cores which are available. And these are the cores because they have kind of a resource name. So standard dash A1 dash core dash count, and this is 4 for me. And you might say, why is this the case? Because this is a free trial account, and now it's changed to an always free account. And in always free, we give you 4 cores of A1 Ampere processor for an unlimited period of time. So that's why I have 4 cores which are available. Everything else is kind of zeroed out. So let's go ahead and even zero out that particular number of cores for a particular compartment. So I will click on a quota policy here. I'll say this is compute quota policy, and give it a description, and I'll write a quota policy here. And what this is saying is set compute core. So we are going to make it 0, and this quota, and then this is the number of cores we just saw in the previous screen. We want to make that set that to 0 in this particular compartment. So what this will do now is anyone who has access to this particular compartment will not be able to create any compute instances, but anybody who has access to other compartments would still continue to be able to provision compute instances. So let's create this quota policy. And now if I go to my compute instance and I'm logged in as the same administrator, in a typical situation, this would be set by an administrator, and then a user would come in and would create instances. So if I click on instance here and I bring up my root compartment, so you can see that there's this is the root compartment. If I click on create instance, I can see here, let me just click on edit, make sure, let me just change my shape, go to Ampere, select the shape, and you can see here always free eligible kind of comes up, right? So select shape, Oracle Linux 8 is fine. I'm basically using this 1 core machine for the A1 processor, and remember I have 4 cores which are available to me. So I click on create here, and I don't want SSH keys, and everything goes fine. I am able to provision an instance, right? But remember, I'm in the root compartment where there is no quota policy. Now let me bring up to the sandbox compartment where we have created a quota policy. So we do the same thing, give a random name. Let this show up here. Click on edit, and it's already picked up the A1 processor here, the Ampere processor. So I have it here, so that's fine, and I don't need SSH, etc. So let me just go ahead and create an instance. And you would see that now it errors out saying that the following compartment quotas were exceeded. Standard A1 core regional count exceeded by 1, because we zeroed it out, and now it's saying that I cannot uh, create an instance in that particular compartment because of that quota policy. So let's quickly go back to the quota policies and just delete that. And I want to show you that it should be it should go back to revert back to the original state. So I deleted that quota policy. If I go back to my compute screen, click on instances and bring up my sandbox compartment, do the same thing. All right, it's already picked up. Let me change from AMD Ampere, and click create. And now you should be able to create an instance without any problem because my quota policy is deleted. So this is how simple it is to set quotas. I definitely recommend using this because this is a really nice way for you to control the resource consumption. Now let me show you one last thing here before we wrap up this particular demo, and that's how to set up budgets on Compartment. Now it's again a nice feature where you can set your budgets on your compartment, so you know how much resource consumption is happening. And this is for situations where you want resources to be provisioned in a compartment, but you want some kind of visibility, oversight, to see that it's not exceeding a particular budget you have. So you can specify a budget here, and let's say we want to do it for the sandbox compartment. And you can choose a target compartment here. It could be root, or it could be the compartment we just created. Let's say compute, or in this case we are doing for sandbox, a sandbox compartment. Actually, there's a budget which already exists for that. So let's just quickly change it to compute. All right, and then it says how much is when do we want to start the budget processing, and what is the budget amount. In this case it's kind of a different currency, but let's say we say it's $100, and now I can set a rule here saying that if I exceed that $100, you should send me an email, send me an alert. And I could do it based on an absolute amount, or I could do it on a percentage of the budget. In this case I would say when it's reaching 90% of this budget, send me an email, and I could specify my email ID here, and I could create a budget. It's as simple as that. And when so this starts automatically tracking the resource consumption, and as soon as I hit those thresholds, it would alert me saying that I exceeded that budget. So it's a nice feature, again, something to use, so you have that visibility over your resource consumption. So these are two quick features available for resource consumption. One, quota policy, where you can set a quota policy on a compartment with a max limit, or you could make it zero. You could zero out, so resources cannot be created. And then the second feature is budget, using which you can again get an oversight on resource consumption happening within your compartment. I hope you found this demo useful. Thanks for your time. Welcome to this demo on OCI network sources. In this demo, we are going to look at network sources in action. So here in incognito window, I'm logged in as a tenancy administrator. And in this particular demo, we are using an identity domain called sandbox. So you can see that I have a single policy here for object storage, which states that the group sandbox group in the sandbox identity domain can manage objects, so can create buckets, can upload objects in a particular compartment called sandbox compartment. So again, just to recap, there is a compartment called sandbox compartment, there is a group called sandbox group, and there is an identity domain called sandbox. So anybody who is a member of this particular group in the sandbox identity domain can manage objects. So just to show you, if I click on identity and security, click on domains, we have had this set up in some of the other demos as well. So if I click on sandbox and click on users, you can see there's a user whose name is John Doe. He is part of this particular identity domain called sandbox. And if I click on groups, you can see that the user John Doe is part of this group called sandbox dash group. So it's a very simple setup, single group, single user in this identity domain called sandbox. So we are keeping it separate than the default domain. This is also a free domain. So with this setup, let me switch over my browser and go to John Doe console here. So you can see here I'm logged in as John Doe. And if I click on, for example, if I click on compute, I can see that I don't have access to create compute instances. Why? Because I have no policies which give me permissions to create compute instances. But if I click on storage and I click on object storage here, you will see that I can create a bucket in sandbox dash compartment. If I just give a random name and click here, you can see the bucket gets created. But if I go a level up to the root compartment, you can see that I have no access here. And just to prove that I don't have access, if I click create here, it gives me an error message saying that we are not authorized to create a bucket here. So let's now, so just to recap, in the sandbox dash compartment, I can still go ahead and create a bucket. So let's change that using network sources. Remember, network sources, the whole idea is you can control access depending on originating IP address. So we will simulate kind of that scenario here. So let me again log in as my tenancy administrator and go to my network sources, and let's create a network source here. It sits outside domain, and let's give it a name. Let's say it's network source for object storage. And now I need to give either a virtual cloud network IP address, a private IP space, or I can give a public IP address. Now let's just give a random IP address 2.2.2.2. So we know for sure that this particular machine where I am logged in doesn't have this particular IP address that we know for sure. So let's just go ahead and create this network source. And now what we would do is we'll go into the policies, and we will edit this current policy to add that particular network source. So we will say request dot network source dot name equal to, and I think it's network source. All right. So this has gone through, right? And I can see here that I added this variable here, request.network source name, and now I'm qualifying. I'm making this a conditional statement saying that only allow this particular group and users within this particular group to manage object family if this condition is true, meaning if the originating IP address is 2.2.2.2. If it is not, don't let me create a bucket. So now if I go back and log in as John Doe, and in the same compartment, I just refresh this compartment and pick this compartment, I can see that my access is now changed. And even in this compartment, it says that I am not authorized to perform this request. So if I click here and I click create a bucket, it would give me an error message saying we are not authorized to create a bucket here. So let's quickly again change it. So let's get what's my IP address. Take this IP address here. This is my machine's IP address. Let's log back to my network source, and let's add this network, public network. I will give this IP address, I'll update it, and I can delete the old one, don't need it. So now what I have done is I have said that I have changed my network source to my IP address for this particular machine, and now I'm saying let this user create an object storage bucket if the originating IP address is this one. And of course we know that because I'm logged in as John Doe from this particular IP address. So now if I switch back to John Doe profile, I should be able to create a bucket here. So refresh my browser here and pick up the sandbox compartment, and you can see that I can view the bucket again. And if I click on create bucket here, just give a random name and click create, now you can see that I'm able to create a bucket. So that was a quick demo on how you can set up network sources. Remember, you create an IP address, whether it's a VCN, whether it's a public network, you can combine both. You can have multiple IP addresses, and the idea is you can control access based on originating IP addresses. I hope you found this demo useful. Thanks for your time.
We will Hello and welcome. In this demo, we will look at a use case to see how we can use tag-based access control to prevent accidental deletion of a compute instances in OCI. We will consider a setup where we have 4 compute instances running in a demo compartment. And suppose one of our VM is running a mission critical application that need to be protected from termination or deletion. For example, if user accidentally deletes a compute instance, prod web VM that is important to our application, it can cause an outage and possibly cause data loss. So we want to make sure that this compute instance cannot be deleted, even if IAM permissions are in place to manage instances in a working compartment. To do this, we can use tag-based access control, where tags are metadata that can be assigned to our cloud resources to help us organize and manage them. They can be used to label resources based on their purpose, environment, owner, or any other criteria that makes sense for our organization. And for this use case, they can be a flag to prevent an instance from being terminated. So let's see how to tag resource and then apply IAM access control. To tag resource, we must first create a tag namespace. For that, we will search tag on the console and select tag namespace under services. Then click create tag namespace. Select the working compartment and provide a name. We will call this namespace as operations and provide a short description. Click create tag namespace and we have created the tag namespace. Under this namespace, we will create a tag key definition. Click operations, click tag key definition, provide tag key as instance type, provide description and select a list of values. And we will give critical and non-critical as tag values, critical and non-critical, and then click create tag definition. As you can see, the key definition has been added to the namespace. Now we go back to the compute instance and tag our resources. First, we will tag prod web VM as a critical and other VMs as non-critical. We will select the instance and then click on more action and then select add tags. Here, I will select operation tag namespace and then select instance type as a key, and then the value will be critical. This tag will act as a flag to prevent instance from being terminated. Similarly, we will tag other VMs as non-critical. So I go back to the VMs, more action, tags, and then I will mark them as non-critical. Similarly for other two instances. Our instances are tagged. Now we can configure IAM policy. We will navigate to Identity and Security. We will select Policy under Identity and click Edit Policy. As you can see, we have a policy for a user which says allow group SecOp to manage instance family in a compartment sandbox. Now we will add a where clause by editing a policy where we say where target dot resource dot tag dot operation dot instance underscore type is equal to non-critical. This policy allows security operation group to manage instances in sandbox compartment only if tag value is non-critical for instance type. Save policy. Finally, we can test the policy. We go back to the compute and click instances. First, I will select a prod web VM and validate the tag. You can see it is critical and now we will try to terminate it. As expected, we receive a permission error, preventing us from deleting the instance. Let us try with other VMs in the same compartment and see the response. We are able to terminate instance. This means that group can manage instances only if they are tagged as non-critical. So to conclude, this was a simple use case to make you understand the tag-based access control. It is a powerful feature that allows us to protect critical resources. By assigning tags to our resource and configuring IAM policy, we can apply granular access control to OCI cloud resources assure their availability and reliability. Thank you for your time. Happy learning.
Welcome to this demo on dynamic groups. In this particular demo, we are going to look at how dynamic groups work. So before we get into the demo, let's do a setup here. So as you can see in the setup, we have a single instance dg underscore instance one running in a specific availability domain in a specific OCI region. And what we want to do now is from within the instance, we want to call OCI object storage and create a bucket. Now remember, this is not a human doing it. It's an application running on the instance calling object storage and creating a bucket. In this case, to make it things easier, we are using OCI CLI. But think about that as an application, which you could replace that with an application running on the instance. So how do we make this happen? As you recall from some of the lessons, if you are calling object storage, you need authentication to prove to say who you say you are, and then also have a policy to give you the authorization, granular permission in order to create buckets. You need those two things, right? So to do those two things, first what we are going to do is we are going to create a dynamic group. And as you recall from the theory lesson, we would create a dynamic group on a compartment. All the instances which are part of that compartment will be included in the dynamic group. And then so that's your authentication. And then we do authorization on that by writing a policy against that dynamic group, giving it permissions to manage object family in a specific compartment, in this case, the sandbox dash compartment. So that's the scenario, that's the setup. Let's get started. Let me switch over to the console. All right, I'm in the console here, and let me just change to my specific compartment. You can see there is a VCN dash DG dynamic group VCN, which is already created. If I click on it, I can see it has a single public subnet, it has a route table, and all. It's just a very simple setup where there's public subnet which has connectivity to the internet, and we are going to spin up a compute instance within this particular VCN using this VCN. And if I click instance here, I have already done that just to save some time, and you can see dg underscore instance one. If I click here, you can see it's an Oracle Linux developer image which we are using, and then this is spun up in the public subnet, and there is a public IP here. So we can SSH into this instance, and we can try to create an object storage bucket. So let's do that. So to do that, let me just bring up Cloud Shell here. And this is the Cloud Shell using which I don't need to install any SSH tools on my machine. I'm using a Windows machine, and I can just SSH into this particular instance. Now to SSH here, I would just use the ID underscore RSA, the private key file here, and let's just give the public IP. And you can see I'm logged on to this instance now, right? So first thing I'm going to do here is I'm going to show you how you can authenticate using the auth principle. To do that, let's say if I want to get my object storage namespace, if I just do this, you would see that it returns me an error saying that I'm not authenticated because it needs some kind of configuration. To change that, I can just simplify this and say that my authentication for this particular command is using the instance principle. And when I do that, you would see that it will authenticate using the instance principle, and now it's returning me a namespace for the object storage buckets, right? So let's create a bucket here, and this is the CLI command. It's pretty straightforward. We are using the OCI CLI, and let me make it a little bigger here. And we are creating a bucket which is named as sandbox dash bucket. And this is the particular compartment which we are using, which is the sandbox dash compartment. And as we showed earlier, we are using instance principle for the authentication. So if I just hit enter here, you will see that this returns an error because right now I haven't created a dynamic group. I haven't created written any policies. So this command is not going to work. And so we're going to change that, and we're going to come back here and run this command again, right? It says, see, either the bucket exists or you're not authorized to create it. And this is basically the reason you're not authorized, so you cannot run it. So let's minimize it, go back to my identity and domain section, click on domains here, and we have been using the sandbox domain. So let me bring it up. And actually the sandbox domain, the scope is root. So that's why you didn't see in a particular compartment I was clicking. So I click on sandbox here. And if I click on dynamic groups, you can see there is nothing in a dynamic group right now. So let's go ahead and change that. So we'll say this is dynamic group for the demo. Right, and the membership in a dynamic group is a dynamic, so it's based on matching rules, and we have this rule builder which helps us create. It's a handy tool to create these matching rules. So you can define a rule based very granularly on an instance OCID, or in this case we are going to do it on a compartment OCID. And the idea here is any instance, all the instances which are part of this compartment will be included in this particular dynamic group. You could do all, you could do any, and you could exclude certain instances. You could write conditional rules here. So it's quite powerful. One thing to keep in mind is just make sure this OCID is the right one, because it doesn't do a validation here. So if you provide wrong values, later on you'll have to troubleshoot and your dynamic group should not work. So I feel good here, click create, and my dynamic group is now created. Now this is the first part, which is the authentication. Now I also need to do authorization for it. So as you recall from the other lessons, policies reside outside the domains. So I click on policies here, and let's go ahead and create a policy for the dynamic group. So we'll call it dynamic group policy. And I want to show you this policy builder. So I'll click on, I think object storage might not be here. That doesn't look like. So we'll do network management, and I'll change it and I'll show you how it works. So in the policy builder, you can see that it gives me a nice handy kind of representation of domains. I'm going to pick my sandbox domain here, and it also picks groups and dynamic groups for me. So it's picking the dg-demo dynamic group, and then it's picking also a scope, whether I want this to apply to the root or I want it to apply to a particular compartment. In this case, I say sandbox-compartment, and this is the handy kind of, it builds this policy for me, so I don't have to do this myself. Now, one thing to keep in mind here is we are going to create a bucket. So this policy is against the virtual network family. We don't need that. Let's just quickly change that to object family, and that's pretty much quite easy to do. And click save change here. And now what this policy is saying is this dynamic group can manage object family. So it can create buckets, it can upload objects, etc. So let's switch over to my compute instance. I'll bring up the Cloud Shell from here. And let's run this command again. And if everything has gone well, we should be able to create this particular bucket. Just let's give it a few seconds. And as you can see here, the bucket is created, right? It gives the name here, and it gives me some metadata saying the bucket has been created. And if I and you can see that it's a private bucket, etc. So if I go here, if I go to my object storage and click on buckets, let's minimize it and bring it to the sandbox compartment. You can see that sandbox dash bucket is created, and I can upload objects, etc. And it's a private bucket because that's the default behavior. So that was just a quick demo of how you could use dynamic groups. It's pretty straightforward. Again, just to recap, you need to create first you need to create a dynamic group, and a dynamic group you can create from within the domains. In this case, we had the sandbox domain, so we created a dynamic group here. All the instances, we scoped it at the scope of a compartment, so all the instances within that compartment are part of this dynamic groups. And then what we did is we wrote a policy against that particular dynamic group to make sure to give it specific permissions. And just one thing to final reminder here is, as you are doing this, just make sure you put the domain name, you prefix the domain name against the dynamic group name with the dynamic group name, so that it's qualified and your policy work. If you miss this, it goes to the default domain. So it's just a quick demo on how you can call services. In this case, compute is calling object storage, but you could have multiple other services call each other. And dynamic groups, as we saw, works with databases, works with functions, and several other services, right? So it's kind of a very simple demo showing object storage getting called from within the compute instance, but you could do this for other services as well. I hope you found this demo useful. Thanks for your time. Welcome to this demo on OCI network sources. In this demo, we are going to look at network sources in action. So here in incognito window, I'm logged in as a tenancy administrator. And in this particular demo, we are using an identity domain called sandbox. So you can see that I have a single policy here for object storage, which states that the group sandbox group in the sandbox identity domain can manage objects. So can create buckets, can upload objects in a particular compartment called sandbox compartment. So again, just to recap, there is a compartment called sandbox compartment, there is a group called sandbox group, and there is an identity domain called sandbox. So anybody who is a member of this particular group in the sandbox identity domain can manage objects. So just to show you, if I click on identity and security, click on domains, we have had this setup in some of the other demos as well. So if I click on sandbox and click on users, you can see there's a user whose name is John Doe. He is part of this particular identity domain called sandbox. And if I click on groups, you can see that the user John Doe is part of this group called sandbox dash group. So it's a very simple setup, single group, single user in this identity domain called sandbox. So we are keeping it separate than the default domain. This is also a free domain. So with this setup, let me switch over my browser and go to John Doe console here. So you can see here I'm logged in as John Doe. And if I click on, for example, if I click on compute, I can see that I don't have access to create compute instances. Why? Because I have no policies which give me permissions to create compute instances. But if I click on storage and I click on object storage here, you will see that I can create a bucket in sandbox dash compartment. If I just give a random name and click here, you can see the bucket gets created. But if I go a level up to the root compartment, you can see that I have no access here. And just to prove that I don't have access, if I click create here, it gives me an error message saying that we are not authorized to create a bucket here. So let's now, so just to recap, in the sandbox dash compartment, I can still go ahead and create a bucket. So let's change that using network sources. Remember, network sources, the whole idea is you can control access depending on originating IP address. So we will simulate kind of that scenario here. So let me again log in as my tenancy administrator and go to my network sources, and let's create a network source here. It sits outside domain, and let's give it a name. Let's say it's network source for object storage. And now I need to give either a virtual cloud network IP address, a private IP space, or I can give a public IP address. Now let's just give a random IP address 2.2.2.2. So we know for sure that this particular machine where I'm logged in doesn't have this particular IP address. That we know for sure. So let's just go ahead and create this network source. And now what we would do is we'll go into the policies and we will edit this current policy to add that particular network source. So we will say request dot network source dot name equal to and I think it's network source. All right. So this has gone through, right? And I can see here that I added this variable here, request.network source name, and now I'm qualifying. I'm making this a conditional statement saying that only allow this particular group and users within this particular group to manage object family if this condition is true, meaning if the originating IP address is 2.2.2.2. If it is not, don't let me create a bucket. So now if I go back and log in as John Doe, and in the same compartment, I just refresh this compartment and pick this compartment, I can see that my access is now changed. And even in this compartment, it says that I am not authorized to perform this request. So if I click here and I click create a bucket, it would give me an error message saying we are not authorized to create a bucket here. So let's quickly again change it. So let's get what's my IP address. Take this IP address here. This is my machine's IP address. Let's log back to my network source and let's add this network, public network. I will give this IP address, I'll update it, and I can delete the old one, delete the old one, don't need it. So now what I have done is I have said that I have changed my network source to my IP address for this particular machine, and now I'm saying let this user create an object storage bucket if the originating IP address is this one. And of course we know that because I'm logged in as John Doe from this particular IP address. So now if I switch back to John Doe profile, I should be able to create a bucket here. So refresh my browser here and pick up the sandbox compartment, and you can see that I can view the bucket again. And if I click on create bucket here, just give a random name and click create, now you can see that I'm able to create a bucket. So that was a quick demo on how you can set up network sources. Remember, you create an IP address, whether it's a VCN, whether it's a public network, you can combine both. You can have multiple IP addresses, and the idea is you can control access based on originating IP addresses. I hope you found this demo useful. Thanks for your time.